I was having lunch with a friend of mine in Soho, and he got a phone call from his mum, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Thatcher's died of a stroke." And my instantaneous thought was, "Well, she can't be dead. She's Margaret Thatcher." Even then, I sort of the indestructible Thatcher was there, but I said to him, "Look, lunch is going to stop because the phone is going to start ringing." And 2 minutes later, the phone rang, and it never stopped ringing for a week.
Yeah, because she's quite a big part of your life, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I did the voice on Spitting Image and so on, and over the years, I've been happy to do interviews and to happily do her voice and so on. So, my first interview was about 20 past 1. 20 minutes after the announcement of her death. Yeah.
Yeah, and can we back 30 years? It's almost now to the 80s when Spitting Image came up. I was a teenager, but I remember vividly. I probably my family is quite political, so they would have talked about Thatcher, but that made me a lot more aware. That was probably for a lot of people in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the 80s was a far more politically aware generation than the present one. And in a way, Spitting Image contributed to that, not in a big way, because what we had was the polarisation of left and right, with attitudes to Europe, attitudes to campaign for nuclear disarmament, attitudes to striking and, the gaining money and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, on a personality level, Spitting Image introduced, particularly teenagers, to the British cabinet. And many people would have been unaware of who the Minister for Transport is. I've no idea who the Minister for Transport is now, to be honest. But, Spitting Image was able to introduce that. Not only introduce teenagers to it, we had a wonderful director on Spitting Image called Peter Harris, who had directed The Muppets, and that's why he was brought on to Spitting Image. He had no interest in politics at all. He was a wonderful guy, but you would be there holding Geoffrey Howe, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he would say, "Now, which side are you on, darling? Which side are you? Are you left or right? Are you Labour or Conservative? Go stand over there if you're a Conservative. Go stand over there if you're Labour." Because he didn't know who they were. He knew who Thatcher was, but that was about it.
Yeah. So you made actually a split.
We did. Well, we had the House of Commons. We actually, before we had actual footage of the House of Commons on British television, we actually had footage of the House of Commons on British television via Spitting Image. We came first, actually, and we had to go over there. We were Tories, and we had to go over there if we were Labour. Yeah,
because in those days it was not allowed to be televised.
That's right. Yeah, but Parliament wasn't televised, and we got in first, as it were. And our behaviour in some way was probably less bad than the real thing.
Yeah. You shaped the view for young people, you say, about of politicians, but it was always a caricature, of course. To what extent was it also real?
Well, I think, for example, with the voice of Margaret Thatcher. Now, the real voice of Margaret Thatcher would be something like this. If you were interviewing her now, this is the sort of voice that she would have. And yes, she would get argumentative. Yes, she would get excited. That was one of the things that she was famous for. That would be the sort of real version. The caricature on Spitting Image was far more steely, so we had to match the grotesqueness of the puppet. So you take that reality, of course it's real, but when you do it on Spitting Image, it gets harsher, it gets more unpleasant, and she didn't sound like this in reality, but there's a bit of the truth in there as well that's been exaggerated.
You had to exaggerate to make it real?
In some ways, it's more real because it's what's going on in your head. We can get into a metaphysical discussion as to what is real and what isn't real. But in some ways, what a caricaturist does is try to imagine what's going in your head as you picture somebody and play with that image, an image in sound if that's possible. But play with that image and try to pick up on something that's in the real person that you haven't quite seen and just sort of extend that. Mrs. Thatcher never really had a pointy nose, but it was very slightly longer than it perhaps you might have imagined, and therefore caricatures would make it longer. Mrs. Thatcher could be argumentative and could have a steely quality in her voice. I just made it more so. That's all I did, really.
And the funny thing is, in a way, she acted her voice as well, wasn't it?
Well, she was a very good actress in a sense. All politicians are to some degree. But what I've been struck by this week, compared to sadly the last 20 years of politics, was actually watching her say what she believed. And she wasn't frightened of saying it. And the other thing about Margaret Thatcher, I don't want to get too technical, but I will. She was able to speak in clear grammatical English. Her sentences had a subject, a verb, and an object. Not many politicians speak like that today. If you disagreed with Margaret Thatcher, you knew why, because she spoke so clearly. You listen to modern politicians, and I can watch Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, and David Cameron, the Prime Minister, and I can nod away at both of them, agreeing with both of them, because I'm not really sure what they've said. But with Mrs. Thatcher, you always knew what she
It was always clear.
always clear what she said, and that's not only because of her voice, but that's because of the way she put sentences together. Yeah. Very few people do that.
Was she an absolute gift for comedians?
Well, she was a comic creation. I mean, she was a. I always say, if you'd have written her in a book, if you'd have written her even as a satirical book, even with the British tradition of the nanny and the whole establishment being frightened of the sort of British nanny, even if you'd have come at her from that tradition, if you'd have written her as a character, nobody would have believed her. You know what I mean? Reality is, in this case, stranger than fiction. But that said, you see, she also was clever enough to pick up on what it was that people were saying about her and how people perceived her. The Iron Lady being a very good example. The Iron Lady was a criticism aimed from Russia. They actually used the phrase Iron Maiden, which is actually a torture chamber when people were actually put inside an Iron Maiden. She very cleverly took that phrase, reinvented it for herself, and applied it to herself. A gift for caricaturists, because then they were able to show her in a full metal armour and so on. But think of it like this. We had a sketch on Spitting Image once where a scientist was analysing her blood, her DNA, and was saying, "My God, this woman, it's uncanny. She's indestructible. Her defence mechanism is impregnable. It's as if she were an alien." And then, the Thatcher shadow appears, and it's not really Thatcher, it's Thatcher as Ridley Scott's Alien from the movie. And then the thing devours the scientist. The point is, if there's a caricaturist, if as a satirist, you're portraying somebody as indestructible, you're doing them a great service. You're not showing them as incompetent or a fool. You're saying that this person can't be beaten. Well, if you can't beat Thatcherism by saying that this person can't be beaten. So caricaturists and satirists were in some ways
helping her.
Well, they were not on her side, but they were certainly helping her along. I think, yeah, we didn't realise that at the time, but we were.
Because you thought you were taking the piss.
We thought we were taking the piss. We thought not that we were going to bring down Thatcherism, but if somebody puts a poster of themselves on the wall, whether it's Labour or Conservative or whatever it is, if somebody puts a poster of themselves on the wall, people like us come along and draw funny versions of it, put glasses on or beards or whatever. That's what caricaturists do. We're part of the sort of counterculture. We simply never realised, and probably until about halfway through the Thatcher term, that we're not servants of Thatcher, but we weren't doing any harm whatsoever.
Because to be clear, nobody of all the actors would actually support her or be a fan of her.
Very few. There were a few. I think a lot of, like myself actually. I mean, I was brought up by a grandmother who believed in self-reliance, hard work, all the Thatcherite values. So I understood where Thatcher came from, because I understood where my grandmother was coming from. And I think many people impersonating Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, what they would often do was they would show what they were thinking of her in the voice. They'd often do her. Somebody described her voice as being speaking to you as if your dog has just died in a very slightly patronising way. I always thought that was the wrong way to do her. I always felt that it would be better to do her as this slightly more combative, honest politician.
But she was, of course, both patronising and combative.
She could be both. I mean, what she did when she was patronising, she was patronising intellectually, in the sense that, you know, when somebody said something that she thought was clearly wrong, she just simply put them down. You know, she wasn't frightened of being patronising from that point of view. But at the same time, she was a politician of I'd say reasonable integrity, and that goes back to the fact that she was honest in what she said. I often disagree with it, but that didn't really matter. You know, even her worst critics would never say that she was disingenuous or intentionally trying to hide what she believed. You could say that about Boris Johnson, you could say that about Cameron, but I don't think you could say it about Thatcher.
She meant what she said.
She meant what she said, and she said what she meant. I mean, you know, it was on both terms.
Spitting Image was, of course, full of characters, but what would it have been without Thatcher?
Disastrous, I think. We went from Thatcher, who sort of probably wanted to be, you know, rule the world, to John Major, Prime Minister, who wanted to be a train spotter. You know, I mean, we went from the sublime to, I think, the ridiculous. And it would be impossible to imagine the Spitting Image had we missed out Thatcher and Spitting Image come 10 years after Thatcher, or at least come along after she'd resigned, because politics was less interesting. We had Ronald Reagan, we had Thatcher, we had Gorbachev. Kinnock. We had. She was also blessed by weak leaders on the opposition side. She would have found it, I think, far more difficult to cope with Tony Blair, who was probably her intellectual superior. He was probably a far cleverer man than she was, and actually, as consummate a politician as she was, she would have found him a bit of a struggle to deal with. But with Kinnock, she wiped the floor with them. And with Hattersley, I also did Hattersley's voice on Spitting Image. And for those that remember, Hattersley was the only character who actually did any spitting. He was deputy leader of the Labour Party. And there was one time in Parliament where he was standing in for Kinnock, and Thatcher was there, and she didn't like Hattersley, she didn't like Kinnock, but she particularly didn't like Roy Hattersley. And he said something like, Prime Minister, can you comment on the economic figures that have just been released today showing Britain in decline? And then she would stand up and say, I am very happy to point out that unemployment is falling, inflation is falling. And then she looked at him and thought, no, I'm not going to continue. Inflation is falling. And then she said, etc., etc., etc. You know, she couldn't be even bothered to go through the figures. Now, that is patronising, but patronising in a very, very powerful, funny way. So she did sort of have a sense of humour. Yeah,
but she's always said she had absolutely no sense of humour.
Well, I don't think she would have said that.
She was too serious.
Well, she didn't have. Well, she was asked to do an interview for a tribute to Ronald Reagan, and the interviewer said to her, "Could you give us an anecdote about Ronald Reagan?" And she said, "I don't do funnies."
Which is funny in itself.
It's funny in itself. There's nothing funnier than a person who doesn't realise they don't have a sense of humour. But she did have a sense of humour that was very, very dry, but also a sense of humour that gave us a guide to her actual beliefs. There's the two quick examples. One was in Europe. There was a European communique, whatever it was, and there was a paragraph on xenophobia. Now, Mrs. Thatcher didn't know what xenophobia meant. She'd never come across the term, so she said, what is this xenophobia? And said, it means hatred of foreigners, Prime Minister. She said, well, that's all right then. And the other one was when England was famously defeated by the Germans in the World Cup, I think the semi-finals of the World Cup. and a football supporter was a bit upset when she had no interest in football at all, but she was told, they said, "I'm very upset." She said, "Why?" She said, "Well," he said, "the Germans have just defeated us in the World Cup." She said, "Oh well, never mind." And then he said, "Yes, but Prime Minister, the Germans have defeated us at our national game." And she looked at him and said, "Yes, but we beat them twice at theirs." Now, actually, that's quite a good line.
Yeah.
If you're in a comedy,
She was sharp and quick.
She was sharp. Now that is what she was. She was sharp and she was quick. An actor, a left-wing actor, who was in the West End, Robert Lindsay, and he tells this story. He was in the West End in a play, Me and My Girl, and she came to see it. And she came backstage and she said, "Let's go out to dinner." And he said, "No, I'm a socialist. I'm not going to go out to dinner with you." She said, "Well, being a socialist doesn't stop you having an appetite." Well, you're laughing. It's a good quick reply. I don't think she had a sense of humour in the sense that she could find herself funny. The only time I saw her on television having not a sense of humour, but a slight sense of the ridiculous was when what happened was there was a journalist doing a piece about her on television, and he was doing a piece to camera about the fact that Mrs. Thatcher was surrounded by journalists, and she just stood in the back of shot, rather like those sort of silly kids who hang around journalists, doing a little wave, slightly ruining his thing to camera, and looked at him rather curiously as he was doing this piece. Which is not again. I'm struggling to find examples.
Well, she did have the occasional joke, the return of the mummy, I think.
Exactly, but I'm not quite sure she quite realised, that the mummy was in the film rather an evil figure who was going to come back and destroy you. I mean, she hadn't watched the movie. And was dead the mummy was dead, monster in bandages. It wasn't the best thing that you could describe. The mummy returns. Yes, a strange thing to say was that.
Yeah. Last week we've talked. Everybody's been reflecting on her legacy, how she shaped politics, the economy. How did she shape the arts in the 80s?
Much of Mrs. Thatcher's attitude to the arts was, I think she just let them get on with it. In terms of, I don't think she was against anybody making fun of her. So there was no sense that it should be that Spitting Image should be taken off air or anything like that. So I think she recognised the counterculture, let them get on with it, and she was a libertarian. She would never have thought of banning things or anything like that. She had not much of a sense of humour, as we sort of talked about. One thing about her, by mistake, she allowed a whole development of alternative culture. What happened was we had BBC One, BBC Two and ITV on British television, and she allowed Channel 4 to come into existence. Now, Channel 4 came into existence for minority broadcasting. Mrs. Thatcher thought that meant people interested in fishing and opera. She thought that was what minority broadcasting would be about. Actually, that isn't what minority broadcasting became about. It became, I wouldn't exactly say a left-wing agenda, but a countercultural agenda. And suddenly you had, punks and music and gay shows and God knows what else. They were all there as part of that counterculture. So actually, by a fault, by a mistake, she actually, we have a lot to thank her for in this country, for presenting on television a counterculture, which, but also she would have understood that the explosion in the media is something that she would have used to her advantage, and been quite happy for people to be against. She never cared about what people thought about her. The whole fuss we have over Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, and whether it should be played on radio, and this bizarre compromise where we're going to play 5 seconds of it, to me to be ridiculous. You either play it or you don't. I think that she would have said, "Play the damn thing. Worse things have been said." And she wouldn't have understood it. She wouldn't have liked it, but she wouldn't have. I don't think she would have been against it.
Did she watch you on Spitting Image?
I don't know. I mean, I doubt it. She didn't watch much television. There was a story that a complicated story, but basically, in one of her speeches, she made a joke about the famous parrot sketch in Monty Python's Flying Circus, and she had to have this sketch explained to her. But they said, "Oh, Prime Minister, if you say this parrot is not dead, it's a dead parrot," or whatever it was, that it would get big laughs, which it did. But before she went onto the stage, apparently she turned around to the person who had written the sketch based on Monty Python's Flying Circus, and she said, "Monty Python, is he one of us? Is he on our side?" Luckily, they were just about to begin the speech, so there was no chance of telling her. But whether she meant that ironically as a joke, that she clearly knew who Monty Python was, but she was just sort of having a bit of fun with her speechwriter. I don't know. It's too late to ask her now, isn't it?
Yeah.